We've just added 2 new posters to our store over at store.armchairhistory.tv. The pointman steadies himself against the doorframe. The sounds of artillery and gunfire are everywhere, drowning out his thoughts. A tap on his shoulder sends adrenaline coursing through his veins. It's time to breach. Inside the concrete house, an insurgent keeps to the shadows. Twice in his lifetime, the Americans have come to his country, and twice his people have had to endure bitter defeat. This time will be different. He pulls a grenade from his belt. The pointman racks his shotgun. The insurgent pulls his pin. The Marine takes a breath. The insurgent touches a photo. Both men pray before the door is blasted open. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. The Second Battle of Fallujah in November 2004 is one of the most notorious of the war in Iraq. It was a bloody slog of urban warfare, during which US, British, and Iraqi forces attempted to drive out Islamist insurgents under the leadership of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian jihadist known for masterminding a series of terrorist attacks. Fallujah marked a turning point in the war. It was the first major battle to be fought entirely against insurgents rather than loyalists of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party. Although ultimately a victory for the US and its allies, this Pyrrhic triumph came at the cost of many civilian lives and failed to break the back of the insurgency, which would continue to thrive in the region. In today's episode, we'll examine how this brutal house-by-house battle unfolded and how it set the stage for a conflict that raged on for years to come. When settling down to relax and watch a long history documentary, it's always nice to have something special to go along with it. The sponsor of today's video, Bright Cellars, aims to help improve your viewing experience in style with a broad selection of wines delivered to your doorstep, either once a month or on demand. Bright Cellars uses a sophisticated algorithm to predict your tastes, based on simple questions answered when you sign up, ensuring your feedback really does make a difference. Each bottle even comes with an educational card giving insight into the vintage, flavor notes, and suggested pairings. When I filled out the questionnaire, I was pleased to receive a pleasant selection of fruity wines, of which my favorite was definitely the Albtraum Zweigelt, so I can vouch for its accuracy. Start refining your knowledge along with your palate and take advantage of a 50% off discount on your first 6-bottle box by signing up to Bright Cellars using the link in the description below. US forces had tried to take control of Fallujah once before, in April of 2004. Following the murder of 4 American private military contractors. That operation, known as Vigilant Resolve, ended with a US withdrawal and an agreement that the local population would keep the insurgency out of the city. But instead, Fallujah would become a significant stronghold for insurgents such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Army in Iraq, among others. As the number of insurgents swelled, American concern grew to match, and by September, US commanders were planning a military operation to seize control of the city, Operation Phantom Fury. The primary motivation was to provide security for Iraq's first elections of the post-Saddam era. But another important strategic objective was the capture of Zarqawi, who was believed by the US to be holed up in Fallujah. US forces had kept a tight hold on Fallujah's surroundings. They maintained checkpoints on all roads leading out of the city and seized any Iraqi police and National Guard vehicles attempting to leave. During the night, AC-130 gunships destroyed every vehicle spotted with a weapon and conducted frequent bombardments of any house suspected to be harboring insurgents. The civilian population, recognizing the costly signs of an imminent American assault, fled the city in droves. Many neighborhoods were totally abandoned, including Fallujah's southern district dubbed Queens by US soldiers. By October, reconnaissance flights showed empty clotheslines and abandoned streets. Indeed, the civilian population was estimated to have fallen from around 280,000 to as little as 30,000. These empty neighborhoods were swiftly filled by more than 3,000 insurgents who took to operating in small groups of between 4 and 20 fighters amid the abandoned homes. These dispersed groups were able to weather the American bombardment in Fallujah's resilient cement houses. Unable to blast them from their shelters, the Americans would have to clear them out, room by room. It would be a hard fight to even get to that point. Since April, the insurgents' numbers had doubled as they drew in combatants from virtually every armed group in Iraq. Trenches were dug, roads blocked with concrete barriers or collections of cars and trucks, jury-rigged emplacements of earthworks and sandbags prepared. The insurgents had even managed to capture some weaponry from coalition forces. Among the most effective defenses, however, were the improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, with which the insurgents riddled the city. Fallujah was covered in booby traps buried under the streets, taped to the side of telephone poles, and hidden in rubble, abandoned vehicles, or empty houses, ready to explode the moment a Marine passed by. Marine Expeditionary Force planners knew they would be walking into an enormous urban death trap, but the Americans had their own advantages. Most notably, their large force of professional and experienced soldiers. For Operation Phantom Fury, Commanding Officer Major General Richard Natanski believed it important to attack Fallujah with as much strength as possible. His forces, reinforced by 2 U.S. armored battalions and a U.S. Army armored brigade, consisted of 10,500 Marines who would be fighting alongside 2,000 troops from the recently established Iraqi security forces and 850 soldiers from the famous Scottish Black Watch Battalion from the British Armed Forces. This coalition vastly outnumbered the insurgents. The Americans also had the advantage of formidable air power, with AC-130 gunships on hand to provide close air support during the fighting. However, these aircraft would only operate at night for fear of being targeted by surface-to-air missiles. This caused serious consternation among commanders on the ground, with one officer remarking they would be fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. Nevertheless, their presence was a major boon to the US during the brutal urban warfare that was to come. Understanding the scale of the challenge ahead of them, American planners worked to ensure there would be no logistical disruptions during the battle, fearing possible attacks on convoys along the highway that could delay shipments and cause shortages. A vast excess of fuel, ammunition, and supplies would be sent to the forces around Fallujah to prevent any need for risky resupply. Major General Natanski divided the city into 2 halves and assigned to each a regimental combat team made up of mostly US Marines and reinforced by an Army armored battalion. These were RCT-1 and RCT-7, built around the 1st and 7th Marine Regiments, respectively. Each was hidden behind a large railway berm to the north of the city, which they would have to break through to begin the assault. RCT-1 would provide the main thrust of the attack, entering the city from the north, which was less heavily defended than the city's southern and eastern entrances. In order to lend an element of surprise to the attack, some elements of RCT-1 would launch diversionary attacks in the south. Meanwhile, RCT-7 would advance from the northeast to support the main assault. Its primary objectives were to ensure the Jolan district, where the insurgent forces were thought to be the most concentrated, and seize control of the Makadi Mosque, which housed the enemy headquarters. Heavy army task forces would lead the way on both thrusts, driving as rapidly as possible toward the city center, while the Marines took on the difficult task of house-to-house clearing in their wake. Meanwhile, the Black Watch would maintain the perimeter around Fallujah and prevent other insurgent forces from cutting the city off. Finally, 3 battalions of relatively well-trained but poorly equipped Iraqi security forces were brought in to support the Americans and provide peacekeeping after the battle. The battle began in the ER. On the night of November 7th, the Iraqi 36th Commando Battalion and their U.S. Army Special Forces advisors captured Fallujah General Hospital and several minor targets in the west and the south, seeking to distract and confuse enemy combatants. They were watched closely by Marines 10 miles away through the infrared camera of a Pioneer unmanned aerial vehicle, who relayed their observations to the forces on the ground via radio. 2 other UAVs were surveying the city that night, seeking out the dark outlines of insurgents clustering in place or manning a heavy weapon. These positions would be relayed to Basher, the codename given to the AC-130 gunships waiting to unleash their deadly payload of 105mm artillery shells. These attacks meant certain doom for their targets. The only escape was to take shelter in a mosque. Targeting a religious building is a war crime, making mosques guaranteed protection from aerial bombardment. Fallujah, known as the City of Mosques, had 200 of these to choose from. Mosques were also reported to house significant amounts of armaments, making them extremely useful locations for insurgent forces. The diversion was successful, securing the peninsula west of the city and the 2 bridges across the Euphrates River, allowing the regimental combat teams to prepare for the main assault to begin the following day. The daylight hours were spent striking key targets with artillery, unmanned predator drones, and guided bomb units to soften up the city's defenses. After dark, the Marines began their attack along the northern edge of the city, with support from tanks and artillery. They first captured the railway station before advancing into the city proper, entering the Heyde al-Dabat and al-Naziza districts by the afternoon of the 8th. The night was cold, with intermittent rain showers, but the Marines' path was regularly lit by the detonation of dozens of rockets and mortars from the insurgents, as well as tank artillery, mortar, and aircraft fire from the Americans themselves. However, some units struggled to break through the railway berm and were stuck for hours as engineers attempted to blast through amid withering fire and rain. The coalition forces made significant progress during the night, but when sun rose on November 9th, the momentum of the battle shifted. The insurgents began to aim their mortars more precisely and effectively, and their fighters took full advantage of the dense urban landscape to whittle down their foes. Small groups of insurgents would dash through the narrow alleys, emerging briefly to fire RPG rounds at their enemies before darting away out of sight, while others used these sturdy cement buildings as pillboxes from which to fire upon the approaching Marines. The fighting was at its most brutal inside the houses. As they advanced, squads of Marines would search each home one by one, clearing them of enemy fighters in slow, exhausting urban fighting. They found no combatants in most, but sometimes, without warning, they would enter a house to see grenades rolling across the floor toward them and a hail of gunfire bursting out of the shadows. Clearing a house required incredible persistence and overwhelming firepower, including the use of Mk-153 rocket launchers. If even these big guns failed, the Marines would resort to smashing the windows, tossing in grenades, and sending hundreds of rifle rounds into the house before bursting in to mop up any remaining foes. But this would be easier said than done. With insurgents lurking in every shadow and booby traps exploding around them, the Marines advanced through the streets of Fallujah at a snail's pace. Both sides would receive scant rest. Each night, with mortar fire continuing to rain down around them, Americans did their best to hunker down inside houses and sleep. In a bid to unsettle them, the insurgents adopted unique psychological warfare tactics, blasting incessant chants from loudspeakers in the city's mosques. In return, US Army Humvees roamed the streets playing everything from Guns N' Roses songs to the Predator sound effect in deafening volumes. The next morning, the urban warfare resumed in much the same way, with brutal fighting for each and every city block. The insurgents were relentless, but by November 11th, the northern half of Fallujah had fallen to the Americans. A day later, as US forces closed in on the insurgent headquarters, American aggression increased. It was estimated 1 in every 20 houses contained hostile troops, compared to 1 in every 50 houses previously thought. Now anticipating enemy fire from every building, the Marines' standing orders became "enter every room" with a boom. As the units advanced, insurgents who had slipped back behind the front line or had remained hidden emerged to trouble the rear of the advancing line. Marines had to remain behind to continually clear and re-clear houses. We spoke to a veteran of the battle who recalls, "We were afraid of doors rigged to explode, since we had to go door to door and clear the buildings, and they didn't care whose house they rigged. We had guys attempt to breach doors of regular civilian homes, and as a result of the door being rigged, it would send shrapnel and debris everywhere." Nevertheless, at the end of the 12th, RCTs 1 and 7 had reached all of their major objectives, but it would take more time for the Marines to fully secure them. Often, the Americans would encounter not enemy fighters, but civilians who had failed to escape ahead of the battle. Although they would typically wave white flags in warning as soon as they heard the Marines approach, sometimes things did not go smoothly. Hundreds of civilians were killed over the course of this bloody house-by-house warfare. At some stage of the fighting, American artillery units began to employ white phosphorus, an extremely deadly incendiary agent, to root out dug-in insurgent forces. The use of this toxic, caustic chemical weapon is considered legitimate if used to illuminate a battlefield or to produce smoke, but its use against enemy personnel is a violation of international law and is a war crime. Some journalists accused the Americans of deploying white phosphorus against civilian targets, an accusation vigorously denied by the US military. It has, however, been admitted to using the weapon against enemy combatants when conventional weapons became ineffective, claiming to have ensured no civilians were present before using it. By December 13th, the fighting had begun to slow. Fallujah was under almost total coalition control, although the occupying forces still faced stiff resistance from isolated pockets of insurgents. Some of the fiercest individual fights came in the battle's closing stages, such as the so-called House of Hell, in which a Marine battalion faced down a group of well-trained, fanatical Chechen fighters in a well-defended home. Around this time, humanitarian operations were allowed to begin, despite continued bouts of airstrikes and small arms fire. RCT-7 set up a humanitarian center at the Al-Hadra Mosque, and Marines in the Jolan district arranged for local Iraqis to enter the city to recover the bodies of dead insurgents. For the following 2 weeks, MEF Command described the ongoing operations as simply mopping up the final pockets of militants. Sporadic combat would continue until the 23rd, after nearly a month and a half of fighting. Since the battle, allegations of war crimes, massacres, and human rights abuses have emerged. This has made Fallujah a focal point for opposition to the war in Iraq and across the West. The battle was brutal, ultimately proving to be one of the bloodiest in the entire conflict. Coalition forces suffered 720 casualties, with 107 killed and 613 wounded. Of these, 95 of those killed and 500 of those wounded were American, while 4 British soldiers were killed guarding the highway. Deaths among the insurgents are estimated as ranging from 1,500 to 2,000 killed, and another 1,500 captured. Fallujah's civilians suffered 800 lives lost over the course of the battle. And in the years since, there's been a marked rise in infant mortality, cancer, and congenital anomalies, or birth defects, a consequence of depleted uranium exposure from munitions. The city, too, witnessed catastrophic destruction, with nearly 1/5 of its buildings destroyed and over half of those remaining experiencing heavy damage. Fallujah, once the city of mosques, had seen 60 of its 200 places of worship destroyed during the battle. Although the city was captured, the coalition had failed to land a decisive blow against the insurgents. Many of them simply slipped away into the surrounding Al-Anbar province, including Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. By 2006, the province, with the exception of the city of Fallujah, was reported to be in total insurgent control, leaving the United States with the hard task of battling them for many years to come.